In this section, we'll be discussing the rebuilding of Western Europe and the Catholic Church. So the Roman Empire has fallen, and a lot of times the fall of the Roman Empire is used to start a period called the Dark Ages. Right? And this was a term. Historians don't like to use it so much. People still use it sometimes. Historians usually prefer to use the term late antiquity, because the Dark Ages is kind of a pejorative term, right? It's saying, this was a dark period. It was a bad period. And that wouldn't bother me so much as a historian, because in many ways it was a bad period. But the problem is, when a lot of times when it's said that it's a bad period, what's not as meant is, oh, this was a difficult time to be alive. What is meant is the people then were kind of ignorant and superstitious, and, let's all have a good laugh at them. Weren't they silly? And I think that is a big problem. You can kind of think about it like this. Imagine if you had a neighbor, and the neighbor has a sick family member, and then they lose their job, and their house burns down. Would it be appropriate to laugh at their misfortune? I don't think it would be. And I think it would be, and imagine if that neighbor were to continue instead of giving up. Imagine if that neighbor were to continue taking care of their parent or their sick family member, were to find a new job, and were to rebuild their house. So what if their job isn't as good? So what if the house isn't as big? I think we would respect that person for trying to pick up the pieces of their lives and trying to rebuild. And I think that's how we should treat the people who lived in this time period that we're looking at now. The Roman Empire has fallen. This great source of peace and stability, though of course with some problems as we talked about previously, is gone. And the people alive are left to pick up the pieces to figure out how to keep going in this very, very difficult situation. And I think that's maybe a better way to approach this. So here's something, though, we have to stress, is that while the Western Empire fell, the church still stood. So remember, Constantine is going to convert to Christianity. He will tolerate Christianity. Later, Christianity will become the official religion of the Roman Empire and will receive a lot of state support. And that allows the church to develop. And what happens then is when the Western Empire falls, the church is still standing. The various church leaders, which are typically in this time period called bishops, the bishops are still there. And people will naturally look to them for help during this difficult time. And it makes sense, right? When everything's falling apart, people are going to look to church, or they're, if they're not Christian, to religion or something oftentimes for help. And that's what these people are going to do. And to really try and illustrate this point, how this is falling apart, politically, the Roman Empire is falling apart, but religiously, you still have the church, which can perform, can try and help society rebuild. I want to talk about the meeting between Pope Leo the Great, that's him here, and Attila the Hun, who I believe is pictured here. And what's happening in the 5th century, remember, that's when Rome falls, when they're getting sacked. And Attila the Hun approached the city of Rome with the intention of attacking it. The Roman emperor wasn't there. And there was really no army to defend the people. So the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, goes out to talk to Attila the Hun, which I think is a pretty brave thing to do, right? You've got a religious leader who doesn't really have an army going to confront a man that everyone was afraid of. Attila the Hun was a scary guy. Remember that the Germanic kingdoms and the Germanic peoples, remember I said that pressure was forcing them into the empire. A lot of that pressure came from the Huns, especially when they were led by Attila. And Leo the Great goes out and meets with Attila the Hun. And what's really frustrating as a historian is there's no good record of what they said. All we know, in a sense, is that Leo went out, he talked to Attila the Hun, and Attila the Hun left without hurting Rome. And historians have lots of reasons, lots of explanations for that. This piece of art tries to emphasize that there was maybe supernatural influence, that saints came or angels came. They were sent by God to intimidate Attila. We don't know. The sources don't really tell us. But what's key is this. Attila the Hun took the Pope seriously, was willing to meet with him, and treated him respectfully as a person of dignity. So the political system might have fallen, but the church is still there, and it's still a force to be reckoned with. So the people who kind of fill the power vacuum, and in a sense, the ones who were, invading the city of Rome, other than Attila, were these Germanic kingdoms, which the Romans, of course, called barbarians. And here's the thing about these kingdoms, and this shouldn't surprise us, the kings were primarily war leaders. Their job was to conquer enemies and reward their followers with loot and land. So a king was a war leader. That was his primary job. Notice it's not to govern, it's to conquer. And to conquer well, to beat up his enemies, and then reward his followers. With the loot he takes from other people, with the land he takes from other people. The problem is, this cannot go on forever. Either A, you're going to conquer everyone, and then, who are you going to conquer next to give stuff to your followers? Or B, your neighbors are too powerful and you can't conquer them. Right? This system of government cannot go on. So once the Roman Empire falls, these Germanic kingdoms that are established after it, we'll talk about one in particular, the Kingdom of the Franks, which will become modern France in another section, they need to figure out how to transition from conquering to governing. They need to shift to administering territory and collecting taxes. Right? They can't just keep on conquering forever and ever. They need to move from being war leaders, or it's okay if they stay war leaders, but they also need to become administrators. They need to become judges, in a sense. They need to administer, protect, and give justice. They need to shift to administering territory and collecting taxes. That requires literacy and learning. You need paper records if you're going to collect taxes. You have to figure out who owns what piece of land and how much they owe. And they have to have a receipt, a record of whether they paid it or not. You have to keep track of who paid it. You need to have a law, a written law that says who has to pay what. All of this requires literacy and learning. They also need to convince the Roman Christians they conquered, who consider them barbarians, to accept their rule. Remember, the Romans did not take these Germanic kingdoms seriously. They said, yeah, maybe you beat us up, but you're still a barbarian. I don't respect you just because you have an axe and you're good at using it. I respect people of culture. I respect Christians. I don't respect you barbarians. So conversion to Catholicism could help solve all these. Well, how? Well, what does the Catholic Church have to offer? Well, for one thing, Catholic priests and bishops knew how to read and write. And they could teach others to do the same. In large areas that had once been governed by the Roman Empire, people forgot how to read and write. That's how bad things were. But the church maintained that. Right? You have to be able to read the Bible. You have to be able to read your prayers for Mass. So priests have to know how to read and write. In addition, and we talked about this earlier, remember, Christianity was connected to classical Greek learning. So the Catholic Church had preserved both classical, that is pagan scholarship, some of the Greek philosophers, as well as Christian and practical learning. So, you want to figure out how to tax. You never had to tax anyone before. Well, the Catholic Church probably has some records somewhere that talk about how that's done. So it gives you practical knowledge. And it could teach all this to these new Germanic kingdoms. So the church is a source of useful knowledge necessary for governing. In addition, converting to Catholicism and supporting and protecting the Catholic Church could give you legitimacy. You're no longer a barbarian, right? Your Latin may not be very good. You may dress strangely, but you're a fellow Catholic, and you're doing what a good Catholic king should do. You're protecting the church, and you're giving it support, giving it money, right? If you're going to do your job and take care of poor people, you need money. So this helps win these Germanic kingdoms the support of their Roman subjects. They could also help lead and keep the peace. Like I said, notice how Pope Leo was the one who went out to meet Attila. These bishops and priests could often be leaders in the local community and help maintain peace, just like Leo did. Moreover, the Catholic Church gave connection to a universal civilization, an advanced civilization, which many of these barbarian kingdoms admired. We have to stress that. Remember, a lot of the Germanic kingdoms wanted to be a part of the Roman Empire. A lot of them weren't really interested in overthrowing it. So they could have a connection to a great civilization, models to emulate. In addition, of course, knowledge of Latin, and you could learn it yourself, or you could have an advisor who's a priest who knows Latin. That helped give you access to all this knowledge, and it could act as a language that could be spoken, that could bring everyone together. At least all educated people together could be brought together, speak Latin to each other, could communicate. And we also have to stress, and this kind of goes back to what you're talking about with Mesopotamia. Everyone, basically 99.9% of people, believed that there were powerful supernatural forces in the world. And to the Germanic kingdoms, the Catholic Church seemed like a powerful repository of supernatural powers. Right? If you read the documents produced during this time period, they're full of stories of miracles and of God's intervention. And this is an altar rather, dedicated to Pope Leo, and there's Attila right there. There's the priest offering mass, and you'll see, similar to other painting, this idea that the saints and angels are there, sent by God to protect Leo and to frighten Attila. So there's this belief, if we become Catholics, if we support the Catholic Church, we'll get this supernatural power. Notice this is very similar to Buddhism. Remember, that was one reason why the Chinese would support Buddhism. It gave access to this supernatural power. Connected to this is the spread of monasteries, and they're extraordinarily important. So what are monasteries? What are convents and monks and nuns? You may not be familiar with this, so I do want to explain what they are. Men who live together in a community, who give up marriage and live with each other in a community, dedicated to following God, to following Jesus. Those men are monks, and they live in monasteries. Right? So they've kind of left the regular secular world to live with other men who want to follow Jesus exclusively. That's why they don't marry. Nuns are the female versions of monks. They live in convents. Now, one thing that's important, remember I said that part of gaining the support of Catholic Romans would be to support and protect the church. Well, one way they do that is they support and protect monasteries, these communities of men. They give them places to live, they give them land, and things like that. And if someone tries to say, hey, those monks are, there's monks have some property, let's go take it, the king will protect them. And so what can they do? Well, they will copy texts. Remember, this is a time period where they don't have printing presses, they don't have computer printers. If you want a copy of a book, you have to copy it or have someone else do it for you. So if you say have a law code, you got to have people to copy it and send it out. So the monks will do this. And not only do they copy practical texts, they'll make copies of the Bible and works on Greek philosophy and things like that. Of course, these monks are also great at teaching and being wise people who study ancient knowledge. They were often useful advisors. In that capacity, again, they're similar to Buddhist monks, which I think is interesting. Monks, they spend a lot of time thinking, they spend a lot of time studying, they often know a lot. Whatever kind of monk they are, be it Christian or Buddhist. They would even create new texts to help support the Germanic kings. So there's a very interesting book, which if you like late antiquity, so-called Dark Ages history. It's called The History of the English Church by a man named Bede, Saint Bede. And Bede tells the story of the conversion of England to Christianity. But he also tells the story in a way to glorify the English kings who converted and promoted Christianity. So what he's doing is saying these English kings are not barbarians. They're good kings. They protected their people and took care of their people by bringing in Christianity. And that gives the king legitimacy. Now, there's someone particularly important you talk about, and that's a man named Benedict. That's an image of him right there. Benedict founded a order of monks that came to be known as Benedictines. Bede himself was a Benedictine. And Saint Benedict, an Italian monk, by the way, he's from Italy, he writes what's called the Rule of Saint Benedict, which basically tells monks how they should live a good, holy life. But what's very important about Benedict is he taught that his monks should work and pray. Right? The job of monks is to work and pray. So you're not just supposed to sit in church all day praying. You got to go out and do manual labor. And I think in part it's because of this idea of Jesus was himself a carpenter, this idea that in some ways work is holy. So think about that. You've got these communities of men. There weren't at this time like really women Benedictines. Women mostly focused on prayer, not on some of the projects we're going to be focusing on. That's mostly what men did. But think about this. You got this community of monks who are dedicated to working and praying. They can do a lot of work, and the kings will put them to work. So, for example, a king may give the monks some land, right? That's how you support the church. You give them land. So the king gives the monks some land, but it may not be very good land. It may be a swamp. It may be an abandoned farm. Well, the monks will work to reclaim and improve that land. Well, that's a good deal for the king because now his kingdom has more food. So the monks are going to perform very important economic functions that will help to recover after the economic catastrophe of the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. They will also not only produce food, they will become economic centers that will produce manufactured goods. So some of these Benedictine monasteries, for example, will start making cloth. Some will make wine. Some will make beer. They'll make lots of different things. And what's key is, we talked earlier with specialization, how that's going to lead, or how, focusing on a particular task is going to make you better at it and develop new ways of doing it better. The monks are going to do that too. So what will happen is the monks might discover a new way of growing food. They might discover that a particular crop grows really well here. So while they're spreading Christianity, and this is one reason why Europe will become Christian, you got these monks out there converting people, they will also be spreading technology and new forms of knowledge. Especially in particular, these monks, these Benedictines, will meet every few years. The various monasteries will each send like a member together to meet in a particular city, and there they will talk about, they'll have a meeting to figure out what they should do, how they can do it better, and they'll share knowledge. Oh, I found out this plow works better, or this kind of crop grows better, or if you let the wine ferment in this way, you get better wine. So they're going to really be contributing to this kind of economic recovery. So what we have here is, with the fall of the Roman Empire, the political system fell, but the religious system, the Catholic Church, is still there in the West. And you've got the rise of these new Germanic kingdoms. And together, these Germanic kingdoms and the Catholic Church, church and state, are going to work together to try and bring union, order, and prosperity to Europe, or Western Europe, after the destructive fall of the Roman Empire. And one thing I have to add that I think is just, I have to note this on kind of a personal level. I'm from Indiana, and there is a Benedictine monastery in Indiana called St. Meinrad's. And there you can see it there. It's quite large. And I think it's either this building or this building that used to be their barn. They used to do farming, and they had horses, and so they had a stable to keep the horses in. But they stopped farming because they just weren't able to keep it going. They don't have enough monks now, and it's not really profitable. Now they make coffins and urns, so they moved more to manufacturing. So they had a stable that they didn't need anymore because they didn't farm anymore. So they changed the stable into a bar, and which is fascinating because it's like you would go to the bar and the bartender was a monk, which I think is hilarious, and I think you could argue contributes to a more healthy drinking culture. But what's hilarious is they changed a stable into a bar. Do you know what they named the stable that they changed into a bar? The Unstable.